She was mine. No one else was ever going to have her. Those chilling words came from a beloved doctor, now 81, arrested for a murder he committed over 50 years ago. What began as a dusty cold case would unravel into a haunting investigation that nearly destroyed the detective who solved it. But the truth she uncovered was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Detective Sarah Miller pulled into her usual parking spot at 7:30 sharp. Her routine never changed. Coffee from the corner shop in her chipped LAPD mug, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the same determined expression she'd worn for the past 7 years in the cold case division. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as she settled at her desk. Her space was meticulously organized. Case files arranged by priority, pens lined up by color, and a single framed photo of her sister Rachel. The photo was old now, the color slightly faded, but Rachel's smile remained frozen in time, 18 forever, disappeared on a hiking trail before Sarah had even finished high school. Morning, Miller. Captain Rodriguez dropped a stack of yellowed folders on her desk. Digitization project. Nothing special. Just scan what's important and log the rest. Sarah nodded, not bothered by the administrative work that would send most detectives into a spiral of complaints. I'll get started right away. Thought you'd say that. Rodriguez gave her a half smile. That's why you're getting the 50s and 60s. Real ancient history. After he left, Sarah sipped her coffee and began sorting the files by decade. Each folder represented someone's unfinished story, victims forgotten by time but preserved in these paper records. The work was methodical, almost soothing in its predictability. Unlike her colleagues who chased the adrenaline of fresh cases, Sarah found satisfaction in these quiet puzzles, in giving voice to those long silenced. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Still on for dinner tonight? Wouldn't miss it, she replied, though they both knew her promise was conditional. In their 3 years together, Marcus had grown accustomed to last-minute cancellations when a case demanded her attention. He never complained, not really, but his resigned understanding sometimes felt worse than anger would have. By noon, Sarah had organized the 60s files and flagged 7 cases that might benefit from modern forensic techniques. She unwrapped her sandwich at her desk, scrolling through emails while chewing methodically. Detective Chen from Homicide stopped by to consult on a case with similarities to one Sarah had solved last year. She walked him through her methodology, pointing out the patterns she'd recognized in witness statements that had eventually cracked the case. "You've got a weird gift, Miller," Chen said, shaking his head. "Seeing connections where nobody else does." Sarah shrugged off the compliment. "Just paying attention." The afternoon passed in the same orderly fashion as the morning. Sarah moved efficiently to her tasks, the rhythm of her day as predictable as her heartbeat. She logged evidence, wrote reports, and returned calls. By 5:30, she had processed 47 files from the 60s, leaving the box of 50s cases for tomorrow. As she packed her bag to leave, Sarah felt the comfortable weight of routine settle around her. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, more files, more methodical work, more small steps toward justice for people whose cases had grown cold with time. This was her life, carefully constructed around the work that gave it meaning. She glanced at Rachel's photo before switching off her desk lamp. "See you tomorrow," she said to the empty office, her voice echoing slightly in the basement room. The predictability of her days provided structure and purpose. Sarah had built her life around these routines, around the satisfaction of bringing order to chaos and closure to the forgotten. As she drove home to change for dinner with Marcus, she was unaware that tomorrow, buried in those 50s files, waited a case that would shatter this carefully constructed equilibrium and draw her into an investigation unlike any she'd faced before. Sarah arrived early the next morning, eager to finish the archival project. The 50s box sat waiting on her desk, filled with manila folders worn soft at the edges from years of handling. She settled in with fresh coffee and began sorting through them, noting how the older cases contained fewer photographs and more handwritten notes than their 60s counterparts. Halfway through the morning, she opened a file labeled Hale Evelyn, Missing Person 1954. Something about this one felt different. Inside was a plastic evidence bag containing a silk scarf with a faint brownish stain. The single black and white photograph showed a dark-haired woman with intelligent eyes and a reserved smile. Sarah paused, coffee halfway to her lips, and read the original detective's notes. Wife reported missing by husband, Dr. Richard Hale, prominent Brentwood obstetrician. No signs of forced entry or struggle at residence. Personal items left behind, including purse and identification. Husband suggests possible voluntary departure due to nervous condition. Neighbors report no unusual activity. The notes were sparse, dismissive even. Just another missing housewife in an era when women's disappearances rarely warranted thorough investigation. But tucked into the back of the file, Sarah found something that made her breath catch. A folded piece of paper, never properly logged as evidence. An unsent letter in elegant handwriting. I feel trapped. I need air to breathe. Richard wouldn't understand, or perhaps he would, which frightens me more. If you're reading this, Jane, please know I'm trying to find courage. Sarah carefully refolded the letter, her mind already making connections. The words resonated with terrible familiarity. She'd found similar sentiments in her sister's journal after Rachel disappeared. The parallel hit her with unexpected force, transforming this 50-year-old case from an administrative task to something visceral and immediate. She pulled up the department database and typed Richard Hale into the search field. To her surprise, a current address in Riverside appeared. He was still alive, 81 years old now. Sarah stared at the screen, the reality of a living suspect in a cold case sending a jolt of electricity through her usual methodical approach. The morning slipped away as Sarah created a preliminary timeline. Evelyn Hale, 32, disappeared from her Brentwood home on June 3, 1954. Her husband reported her missing after returning from his medical practice. Initial investigation lasted only 2 weeks before being classified as a voluntary departure, a family matter, rather than a potential crime. Sarah noted inconsistencies in Dr. Hale's statements. He claimed Evelyn was happy and content, yet had also described her as emotionally fragile. He suggested she might have gone to visit family in San Diego, yet her purse and identification remained in the house. There was a mention of unusual soil samples found on the bedroom carpet, but never analyzed. By lunchtime, Sarah had filled several pages with notes and questions. This wasn't just another cold case. It was a life interrupted, a woman's voice silenced. As her colleagues filtered out to grab lunch, Sarah remained at her desk, staring at Evelyn's photograph. "What happened to you?" The question formed in her mind with unusual intensity. When Captain Rodriguez passed her desk, Sarah made a decision. "Cap, I'd like to look into this one." She held up the Hale file. "Preliminary only. See if there's anything worth pursuing." Rodriguez glanced at the date. 1954? That's ancient history, Miller. The husband's still alive. In Riverside. That got his attention. Really? Well, keep it low priority. Use your own time if you need extra hours. Budget's tight this quarter. After he left, Sarah carefully removed the photograph of Evelyn Hale from its acidic paper folder and placed it in a new archival sleeve. "I hear you," she whispered to the image. Then she pulled out a fresh legal pad and began writing a list of records to request: property deeds, medical license information, insurance policies. The familiar fire of investigation kindled in her chest, stronger than usual, fueled by the haunting parallel to her sister's case and the simple, devastating words from Evelyn's unsent letter. "I feel trapped." The words echoed in Sarah's mind as she worked through lunch, already knowing she would cancel dinner with Marcus again tonight. Some cases couldn't wait, even after 50 years. The county records archive smelled of dust and forgotten paper. Sarah stood at the entrance, momentarily overwhelmed by the sheer volume of history stored in the warehouse-like space. She'd investigated cold cases before, but rarely had she gone this far back in time. The digital databases she typically relied on wouldn't help here. 1954, Brentwood area. The archivist Helen peered at her over reading glasses. "That's all paper records, honey. Some might be on microfilm if you're lucky." Sarah nodded. "Whatever you've got. I'm looking for anything related to Richard and Evelyn Hale. Follow me." Helen led her through narrow aisles formed by towering shelves. Most folks want the computerized stuff. Nice to see someone willing to get their hands dusty for a change. The marriage certificate came first. Richard and Evelyn Hale, wed in 1948. He was 25, already a medical school graduate. She was 26, listed as a former nurse. Sarah carefully photographed each document with her phone, building a chronology of their life together. Property records showed the purchase of their Brentwood home in 1951, coinciding with the expansion of Dr. Hale's obstetrics practice. Tax records indicated his growing prosperity year by year. But Evelyn became increasingly difficult to trace after 1952. No employment records, few mentions in social registers or community events. "Like she started disappearing before she disappeared," Sarah murmured, noting this pattern in her growing case file. By late afternoon, Sarah hit what felt like gold, a withdrawn divorce petition dated June 2, 1954, just one day before Evelyn was reported missing. The document had never been mentioned in the original police investigation. Sarah's heart raced as she examined it closely. The petition cited cruel and inhumane treatment before being abruptly withdrawn. "Why wasn't this in the police report?" she whispered to herself, knowing the likely answer. In 1954, a prominent doctor's reputation would have been carefully protected, a wife's accusations easily dismissed. The next day, Sarah drove to Brentwood, finding the Hales' former address now occupied by a modernized mansion bearing little resemblance to the home in the case file photographs. Standing on the sidewalk, she tried to visualize the scene as it would have been in 1954. The manicured lawn, the Spanish-style architecture common to upscale homes of that era. The quiet neighborhood where a woman could vanish with so little lasting concern. The Santa Monica Public Library yielded newspaper coverage of Evelyn's disappearance, brief mentions on inside pages quickly supplanted by other news. "Doctor's wife missing," read one headline, followed days later by "Search called off for missing woman." The articles subtly suggested emotional instability, quoting Dr. Hale about his wife's fragile state of mind and previous threats to leave. The narrative had been established early. This was a troubled woman who abandoned her marriage, not a potential victim. "You didn't just walk away," Sarah said to Evelyn's photograph that evening as she updated her case notes in her apartment. "Not after filing for divorce. Not without your purse." The breakthrough came 3 days later. Sarah tracked down Margaret Wilson, a 92-year-old former nurse who had worked with Dr. Hale in the early 50s. Despite her age, Margaret's mind remained sharp, her memories of the Hales vivid and disturbing. "Such a lovely woman Evelyn was," Margaret said as they sat in the sunny common room of her retirement community. "Always kind to us nurses when she visited the clinic, but afraid, I think, especially toward the end." "Afraid of what?" Sarah asked gently. "Of him, of course." Margaret's hands trembled slightly around her teacup. "He controlled everything, what she wore, who she spoke to. Once she came to the clinic with bruises on her wrists. When I asked about them, she said, 'If I disappear someday, don't believe whatever he tells you.'" Sarah felt a chill, despite the warm room. "Did you tell the police this when she disappeared?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "Oh, I tried." The detective wasn't interested in what a nurse had to say about a respected doctor. Said she'd probably run off with another man. "That's how it was back then, dear. Women were either saints or sinners, nothing in between." Driving back to the precinct, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since 1954 and how much hadn't. The casual dismissal of women's fears. The protection afforded to powerful men, the ease with which inconvenient narratives were rewritten or erased. This isn't just about solving a cold case, she told Captain Rodriguez during their update meeting. It's about correcting a historical wrong. Evelyn Hale deserved better from the system. Rodriguez looked skeptical but nodded. Keep going, but remember, we need evidence that holds up today, not just a different interpretation of history. Sarah understood the challenge ahead. She wasn't just investigating a missing person case. She was trying to bridge a 50-year gap in justice, to overcome decades of institutional neglect and the cultural blind spots that had allowed a woman's disappearance to go uninvestigated. As she pinned Margaret's statement to her growing case board, Sarah knew she was stepping into unfamiliar territory, becoming not just an investigator, but a translator between past and present, giving voice to someone the system had been all too willing to silence. Sarah stared at the silk scarf sealed in its evidence bag, the faint brownish stain barely visible after 50 years. "Is there any chance you could get DNA from this?" she asked Dr. Lena Ortiz, the forensic lab's most experienced technician. Lena examined the scarf carefully, her latex-gloved fingers gentle against the delicate fabric. "Normally, I'd say no way after this long, but it looks like it was sealed pretty well, minimal exposure to light and humidity." She glanced up. "Might be worth trying. No promises, though." "That's all I'm asking." Sarah knew she was calling in a favor. The lab's backlog of current cases meant a 50-year-old missing persons investigation would normally go to the bottom of the priority list. "For you, Miller, I'll run it myself." Lena carefully took samples from the stain. "Give me a week, and you owe me coffee for a month." While waiting for the lab results, Sarah focused on the mysterious red soil noted in the original case file. Research revealed that the distinctive iron-rich soil was specific to certain areas of Santa Monica Canyon. She spent hours poring over geological surveys and 1950s land development maps, identifying potential locations where a body might have been concealed. Initially, her colleagues had been skeptical. Officer Jenkins had actually rolled his eyes when she mentioned the Hale case. "Seriously, Miller? Some society wife who ran off 50 years ago? Good luck with that wild goose chase." But attitudes began to shift as Sarah's evidence board grew more detailed. Jenkins himself became intrigued when she reconstructed the timeline of Evelyn's last known movements. "Look here," she explained, pointing to her carefully organized timeline. "There's a 4-hour window on the day she disappeared where Dr. Hale's whereabouts are unaccounted for. His alibi depends entirely on his own testimony and a clinic ledger he personally maintained." Even Captain Rodriguez began showing genuine interest, especially when Sarah discovered that Dr. Hale had purchased a substantial life insurance policy on Evelyn just 3 weeks before her disappearance, with himself as the sole beneficiary. "The original investigators never found this?" Rodriguez asked, examining the policy documents. "They never looked," Sarah replied simply. Her most valuable ally emerged unexpectedly. After numerous calls and letters, Sarah located Evelyn's niece, Lisa McAdams, now 60 years old and living in San Diego. Their first phone conversation was brief, Lisa clearly hesitant to reopen painful family history. But when Sarah mentioned the unsent letter, something changed. "You found her letter?" Lisa's voice had cracked with emotion. "I need to see you." They met the following weekend at Lisa's modest home near the coast. Though initially reserved, Lisa gradually opened up, especially when Sarah shared her discoveries with complete transparency. "Aunt Evelyn was my favorite," Lisa revealed, emotion thick in her voice. "I was only 9 when she disappeared, but I remember how alive she made everything feel. She'd take me to museums, read me stories with all the voices." Most valuably, Lisa produced a small collection of letters and photographs, including one showing Evelyn wearing the silk scarf found in evidence. But the true revelation was Evelyn's diary from 1953, which Lisa's mother had kept hidden for decades. "Mom never believed Aunt Evelyn just left," Lisa explained, "but my father insisted we not get involved. Said Uncle Richard was too powerful, that nothing good would come of challenging his story." The diary entries revealed a woman increasingly desperate to escape her marriage, describing Richard's jealous rages and controlling behavior. "Last night was the worst yet," one entry read. "The neighbors must have heard. Mrs. Wilson next door was watering her roses early this morning and wouldn't meet my eyes." "I always knew he was involved," Lisa said firmly. "No one would listen to a child back then, but I heard things, arguments, crying. When they told me she'd gone away without saying goodbye, I knew it wasn't true. Aunt Evelyn would never leave without saying goodbye to me." Sarah adapted her investigative techniques to accommodate the fragmented nature of the evidence. Unable to rely on modern surveillance footage or cell phone records, she created detailed visual maps connecting witness statements, timeline discrepancies, and physical evidence. She consulted with a historian specializing in 1950s Los Angeles to better understand the social context and neighborhood dynamics of Brentwood during that era. When traditional police databases yielded limited information, she explored alternative archives, medical board records, insurance claim histories, property transactions. The case began consuming Sarah's life. Her relationship with Marcus showed signs of strain when she repeatedly canceled plans. "It's just dinner, Sarah," he said during one particularly tense phone call. "How many rain checks can one case justify?" "This isn't just any case," she tried to explain. "This woman's been waiting 50 years for someone to actually look for her. And I've been waiting 3 weeks for my girlfriend to show up for a meal," Marcus countered. "Call me when you remember there's a present day, too." Sarah knew he had a point, but couldn't step away, not when Dr. Ortiz called with preliminary results showing 2 distinct DNA profiles on the scarf, one likely belonging to Evelyn based on familial comparison with Lisa's sample, the other potentially male. Not when she discovered through old dry cleaner records that Dr. Hale had a blanket cleaned the day after Evelyn's disappearance, with notes indicating red soil stains. Every new investigative approach brought Sarah closer to the truth, and the momentum propelled her forward despite the personal cost. She was learning to navigate unfamiliar terrain, developing tools to bridge the 50-year gap between Evelyn's disappearance and justice. Each night she worked later, each morning she arrived earlier, the caseboard expanding until it covered an entire wall of her small apartment. "I hear you," she would whisper to Evelyn's photograph before falling into exhausted sleep. "I'm listening now." Assistant District Attorney David Rosen was not easily impressed. Sarah had worked with him on 3 previous cold cases and knew his skepticism was both professional and profound. He adjusted his glasses as he examined the file she'd placed on his desk. "Let me get this straight," he said. "You want to build a murder case against an 81-year-old respected doctor based on a 50-year-old stained scarf, some soil samples, and diary entries?" Sarah remained composed. This was exactly the reaction she'd expected. "There's more," she explained, sliding forward additional documents from her folder. Life insurance policy taken out 3 weeks before she disappeared. Divorce petition filed the day before. Withdrawn with what our handwriting expert confirms is a forged signature. And the timeline inconsistencies in Dr. Hale's alibi are significant. Rosen leafed through the documents, his expression shifting from skepticism to cautious interest. "It's circumstantial," he admitted, "but compelling in its totality. What else do you need?" "A body," Sarah said without hesitation. "Or at least proof that Evelyn never left Los Angeles alive." Finding Evelyn's remains presented Sarah with her greatest challenge yet. Working with geologists and using the soil samples from both the scarf and blanket, She identified 3 potential locations in Santa Monica Canyon, matching the distinctive soil composition. Securing search warrants proved difficult. You want to dig up private property based on a 50-year-old soil sample? Judge Harmon had asked incredulously during the warrant hearing. Based on that and substantial additional evidence suggesting foul play, Sarah countered, detailing the timeline discrepancies, life insurance policy, and witness statements. Eventually, the judge relented, but with strict limitations. They would have 48 hours at the first location, a currently undeveloped parcel once accessible by car, but now surrounded by luxury homes. The dig began on a foggy Tuesday morning. Sarah coordinated with a forensic archaeology team specializing in recovering remains from cold cases. The work was painstaking, each layer of soil carefully removed and sifted, the stratigraphy documented to establish time of burial if anything was found. Hour after hour passed with nothing significant discovered. By Wednesday afternoon, with their time running short, the team had found only a few metal objects consistent with 1950s refuse. An old soda can, rusted gardening tools, nothing connected to Evelyn. "That's it for this site," the lead archaeologist told Sarah as they packed up their equipment. "We've gone down to undisturbed soil everywhere." Sarah tried to hide her disappointment. She'd been so certain this location, which matched both the soil type and had been relatively secluded in the 50s, would yield results. While waiting for permission to search the second location, Sarah focused on building a psychological profile of Dr. Hale. She interviewed former colleagues, patients, and neighbors, constructing a dual portrait that revealed disturbing patterns. The respected, charming physician, described by professional associates, contrasted sharply with the controlling, volatile husband glimpsed by those closer to the couple's private life. With the help of a forensic psychologist, Sarah identified patterns consistent with highly controlled narcissism, someone capable of maintaining a public facade while hiding darker impulses. The second excavation site yielded nothing, increasing pressure from both Captain Rodriguez and ADA Rosen to consider scaling back the investigation. "Sarah, be realistic," Rodriguez said during their weekly meeting. "We've invested significant resources. At some point, we have to accept that some cases may never be fully resolved." "One more site," Sarah insisted. "The third location is the most remote. If he was trying to hide a body, that's where he'd go." The third location was challenging to access. A steep slope that would have been accessible by car in 1954, but required special equipment now. Sarah's persistence was rewarded on the second day, when the team uncovered a silver charm bracelet with the initials EH engraved on a heart-shaped pendant. She immediately called Lisa, who confirmed through tears that the bracelet had belonged to her aunt, a gift from Evelyn's parents on her 18th birthday. The discovery energized the search, and the following day, the team uncovered human remains buried 6 feet below the surface. Initial field analysis indicated a female approximately 30 years of age, consistent with Evelyn, though DNA confirmation would take time. Sarah's approach culminated in a sophisticated evidence integration that compensated for the age of the crime. Working with forensic experts, she created a 3-dimensional reconstruction of the Hales' 1954 Brentwood house based on original architectural plans and photographs. Using this model, alongside modern blood pattern analysis techniques, they demonstrated how blood evidence described in the original case notes, but never properly analyzed, indicated a violent struggle in the bedroom, followed by a drag pattern to the garage, consistent with a body being removed from the premises. The DNA results finally arrived 6 weeks later, confirming the remains belonged to Evelyn. More damning still, the analysis showed fractures to the hyoid bone consistent with manual strangulation. The second DNA profile from the scarf, though partial, contained enough markers to establish a high-probability match to a sample obtained from Dr. Hale's discarded coffee cup during surveillance. Sarah presented the completed case file to ADA Rosen with a quiet confidence that belied her exhaustion. Months of investigation had produced a solid theory of the crime, supported by physical evidence, witness testimony, and forensic science. "We can make this case," Rosen said, closing the file. "It won't be easy. Defense will argue evidence degradation, question chain of custody, and play on jury sympathy for an elderly defendant. But the science is sound, and the story it tells is compelling." Sarah nodded, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. The case against Dr. Richard Hale was ready to proceed, transforming from historical curiosity to prosecutable homicide. Justice, long delayed, was finally within reach, but the cost had been high, not just for Evelyn, whose life had been cut short, but for everyone touched by the ripples of that violence across 5 decades. "Let's bring her home," Sarah said simply. The arrest of Dr. Richard Hale unfolded with quiet efficiency on a sunny June morning. Sarah watched from her unmarked car as uniformed officers approached the elderly man on his driveway, intercepting him just before his regular golf game. There was something surreal about seeing this frail octogenarian, hands now cuffed behind his back, being read his rights, his neighbors emerging from their homes in shock and disbelief. News cameras arrived within minutes, drawn by the sensational nature of the arrest, a respected doctor charged with his wife's murder after more than 5 decades. Sarah ducked down in her seat, avoiding the lenses swinging toward any official-looking vehicle. This wasn't about her, it was about Evelyn. As Dr. Hale was driven away, his expression remained impassive, almost resigned. Sarah had expected to feel triumphant in this moment of culmination, the result of months of relentless work, yet what she experienced instead was a strange hollowness. The weight of justice delayed for so long that even its arrival felt somehow inadequate. The media frenzy that followed tested Sarah in unexpected ways. Headlines blared across local and eventually national news. Doctor arrested for 1954 murder of wife. Cold case detective breaks 52-year-old mystery. Justice delayed, the Evelyn Hale story. Reporters camped outside the precinct, hungry for details and a glimpse of the detective who cracked the case. Sarah's captain encouraged her to embrace the publicity. "Good for the department, good for your career." But she recoiled from the spotlight, uncomfortable with attention that seemed to celebrate her rather than honor Evelyn. When she reluctantly agreed to a single interview with the Los Angeles Times, she insisted on focusing on the investigative process and the importance of not abandoning victims, regardless of how much time had passed. "This isn't about innovative detective work," she told the reporter firmly. "It's about giving the same attention to a woman who disappeared in 1954 that we would give to someone who disappeared yesterday." The resulting article positioned her as a crusading heroine anyway, complete with dramatic photographs and pull quotes that made her cringe with their sensationalism. "Avenging Angel of Cold Cases" read one particularly awful headline, accompanied by a photo of Sarah looking intently at Evelyn's picture. Professional recognition arrived alongside the media attention. Sarah's colleagues, once skeptical, now treated her with newfound respect. Captain Rodriguez presented her with a formal commendation, and there were whispers about possible promotion opportunities. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit requested her case notes for their training program on cold case methodologies. Even ADA Rosen, initially doubtful, now praised her thoroughness and innovation. "You've given us a textbook example of how to prosecute a historical case," he told her during a pre-trial meeting. "We're already using your approach as a template for other cold cases." This was what she wanted: professional validation, institutional acknowledgement of Evelyn's case, and a path forward for other forgotten victims. Yet, as Sarah sat alone in her apartment that night, surrounded by congratulatory messages and interview requests, she felt strangely disconnected from these external measures of success. The personal cost became increasingly apparent as weeks passed. Marcus finally ended their relationship after months of growing distance, telling her with quiet resignation, "You're already married to your work, Sarah. There's no room for me." She couldn't argue with his assessment. The case had consumed her, leaving little emotional energy for anything else. Their final conversation was brief and painful, both acknowledging that something valuable had been sacrificed to Sarah's pursuit of justice for Evelyn. Her sleep was disrupted by vivid dreams, not triumphant visions of justice, but unsettling images of Evelyn, trapped and crying out across decades, only to be heard too late. Sarah began experiencing anxiety attacks, triggered by seemingly innocuous reminders of the case. During a routine evidence review, she found herself suddenly unable to breathe, overcome by the weight of Evelyn's stolen life and the inadequacy of justice that comes 50 years too late. The department psychologist suggested she take leave, warning about burnout and vicarious trauma, but Sarah refused. She needed to see the case through to its conclusion. As the preliminary hearing approached, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She visited Dr. Hale in detention, seeking answers that evidence alone couldn't provide. The detention center's visiting room was stark and institutional. Dr. Hale shuffled in wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung on his diminished frame, making him look even more frail. But his eyes were sharp, assessing Sarah with the same clinical detachment she imagined he'd once used with patients. "Detective Miller," he acknowledged, settling slowly into the chair across from her. "I've been expecting you." "Why?" she asked simply, skipping the preliminaries. Why kill her when she only wanted freedom? For a long moment, he said nothing, studying her with unnerving intensity. Then he responded with chilling composure. "She was mine. I gave her everything. A beautiful home, social status, the best of everything. She had no right to leave." His words, devoid of remorse, confirmed what Sarah had known intuitively. His crime wasn't a moment of passion, but an act of ownership, the ultimate expression of control. 50 years hadn't softened his conviction that Evelyn had been his possession to dispose of as he saw fit. As she left the detention center, Sarah realized she'd gotten exactly what she wanted: the truth, the case, the recognition. But these victories felt Pyrrhic, tainted by the revelation of a moral emptiness she could barely comprehend. That night, alone in her apartment, with the commendation certificate lying unopened on her coffee table, Sarah finally allowed herself to cry. For Evelyn, for the justice that came too late, for her own lost relationship, and for the hollowness of a victory that couldn't undo decades of silence and neglect. The justice she delivered was necessary, but ultimately inadequate, a pale shadow of the life Evelyn should have lived. The preliminary hearing arrived with the courtroom packed to capacity. Media representatives filled the back rows, their whispers creating a constant undercurrent of sound. Medical colleagues of Dr. Hale occupied one side, many openly glaring at Sarah as she entered. On the other side sat Lisa McAdams and a few elderly women Sarah recognized as former neighbors and colleagues of Evelyn's. Sarah sat rigidly beside Ada Rosen, acutely aware of the hostility directed at her from Dr. Hale's supporters. Her testimony lasted nearly 6 hours as she methodically walked through the evidence collection, forensic analysis, and investigative timeline. Defense attorney James Whitman was renowned for representing high-profile clients. Tall and impeccably dressed, he projected confidence and authority as he approached for cross-examination. "Detective Miller," he began with practiced concern, "how many active cases is your division currently handling?" Sarah knew where this was heading. Approximately 37 cold cases are in active investigation. Yet you devoted extraordinary resources to this particular 50-year-old case. Why this one, detective? She kept her answer professional. The evidence warranted further investigation. Initial review suggested the original investigation was incomplete. Whitman nodded thoughtfully. "Isn't it true, Detective Miller, that your sister's disappearance has created a psychological need to solve similar cases, potentially clouding your objectivity? The question hit with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as her most private motivation was exposed in open court. Though Rosen's objection was sustained, the damage was done. Her personal connection was now part of the public record, her professional detachment called into question. Following her testimony, Sarah faced increased scrutiny from both media and her department. An internal affairs officer requested a meeting to discuss potential conflicts of interest. In her handling of the case, though ultimately cleared of any procedural violations, the investigation left a mark on her service record, a note questioning her emotional distance in cases involving missing women. Meanwhile, a particularly aggressive reporter began digging into her sister's disappearance, publishing a speculative piece that drew uncomfortable parallels between Rachel's case and Evelyn's. The article forced Sarah to relive her most painful memories under the harsh light of public attention, reopening wounds she'd spent decades trying to heal. When the reporter attempted to contact her parents for comment, Sarah reached a breaking point. She confronted him in the courthouse hallway with such intensity that security had to intervene, creating yet another headline: Hale Case Detective Loses Cool Under Pressure. The psychological toll intensified as Sarah began experiencing flashbacks, not just to moments from the investigation, but to the night of her sister's disappearance. During a critical pre-trial meeting, a panic attack left her gasping for breath in the courthouse restroom. Lisa found her there, gripping the sink with white knuckles, struggling to breathe. "Sarah, are you okay?" Sarah couldn't answer, couldn't explain the tightness in her chest or the roaring in her ears. Lisa stayed with her, a steadying hand on her back until the worst passed. "You're killing yourself for this case," Lisa said softly, holding Sarah's trembling hands. "Evelyn wouldn't want that. I don't want that." Through broken sentences, Sarah confessed her growing fear that bringing justice to Evelyn had somehow reopened the possibility that Rachel would never receive the same closure. The two women, connected by different but parallel losses, shared a moment of raw vulnerability. Lisa eventually convinced Sarah to speak with a trauma counselor who specialized in working with family members of missing persons and law enforcement officers. It was a reluctant first step toward acknowledging that her pursuit of justice had exacted a devastating personal toll. As the trial date approached, Dr. Hale's defense team employed increasingly aggressive tactics. They filed motions questioning the chain of custody for the decades-old evidence, challenged the reliability of DNA testing on aged samples, and attempted to exclude Evelyn's diary as hearsay. Most disturbing to Sarah was their character assassination strategy against Evelyn herself. Whitman began painting her as emotionally unstable and potentially suicidal, a woman who might have taken her own life rather than face the shame of a failed marriage. When this narrative began gaining traction in certain media outlets, Sarah watched helplessly as Evelyn was victimized a second time, her character distorted to protect her killer. During one particularly difficult day, Sarah found herself standing at the evidence locker, holding Evelyn's scarf and weeping silently, overwhelmed by the inadequacy of a justice system that could be manipulated to serve the powerful, even from beyond the grave. The heaviest price came when Sarah finally confronted the connection between Evelyn's case and her sister's disappearance. After a grueling deposition session, she drove to the remote hiking trail where Rachel was last seen 25 years earlier. The trail looked smaller than she remembered, less ominous in the soft afternoon light. Sarah walked the familiar path alone, each step bringing memories of search parties, police interviews, and the gradual fading of hope as days turned to weeks, then months, then years without answers. Sitting on a rock overlooking the valley, Sarah acknowledged what she'd been avoiding. Solving Evelyn's murder would not bring Rachel back or provide answers about her fate. The two cases, though emotionally intertwined in Sarah's mind, existed in separate realities. As dusk fell over the mountains, Sarah performed a ritual she'd avoided for decades. She said goodbye. Not to the hope of finding Rachel someday, but to the belief that professional success could heal personal wounds. "I'm still looking for you," she whispered to the empty air. "But I need to stop looking for you in other people's stories." This painful recognition forced Sarah to confront the fundamental motivation behind her career choice and her relentless pursuit of cold cases. The price of this awareness was devastating, a shattering of the protective mechanism that had driven her for years. Yet within this breakdown lay the seed of a more honest relationship with her work and herself. Driving back to the city as darkness fell, Sarah felt something shift inside her. Not healing exactly, but a kind of realignment. Evelyn deserved justice regardless of Sarah's personal ghosts. And Sarah deserved to pursue that justice without destroying herself in the process. The trial began on a sweltering August morning, the courthouse air conditioning struggling against the heat and the packed gallery. Sarah sat in the front row beside Lisa McAdams, both women dressed conservatively, in respect for the gravity of the proceedings. Across the aisle, Dr. Hale appeared remarkably composed in an expensive suit that hung loosely on his diminished frame, surrounded by a defense team whose confidence bordered on arrogance. ADA Rosen's opening statement painted a damning picture of coercive control, escalating to murder when Evelyn sought escape. "This is a case about ownership," he told the jury. Dr. Hale believed he owned his wife, her body, her future, her very life. When she tried to leave, he made sure no one else could have her either. Defense attorney Whitman countered with a narrative of reasonable doubt. The evidence was old, memories unreliable, modern analysis potentially flawed when applied to historical samples. The prosecution asks you to convict a healer, a man who delivered thousands of babies into this world, based on degraded evidence and speculative reconstruction of events no living person witnessed. As the proceedings unfolded, Sarah noted the subtle theatricality of the defense, how Whitman positioned Dr. Hale to appear frail and confused at strategic moments, then remarkably lucid when addressing the jury directly. The performative nature of the courtroom struck Sarah as another form of injustice, truth reduced to spectacle, Evelyn's life and death merely props in an elaborate production. The forensic testimony became a battleground of experts and counter-experts. Dr. Ortiz presented the DNA findings with clinical precision, explaining how modern techniques allowed for valid analysis of the preserved samples. The defense brought in their own expert, who questioned the methodology, suggesting contamination or degradation could have compromised the results. "In your professional opinion," Whitman asked his expert, "is it possible that improper storage over 5 decades could lead to cross-contamination of DNA samples?" "Absolutely," the expert replied confidently. "DNA analysis of samples this old is inherently problematic. The results should be viewed with extreme caution." On cross-examination, Rosen established that the defense expert had never actually examined the evidence in question, merely offering theoretical objections. Still, Sarah worried about the seeds of doubt being planted. When the archaeologist who recovered Evelyn's remains testified about the burial site and fracture patterns consistent with strangulation, Whitman attacked her credentials and introduced an alternative theory that animal activity or natural ground shifting could explain the bone damage. Each scientific fact presented by the prosecution was met with deliberate obfuscation, creating a fog of technical jargon. During a recess, Sarah overheard 2 jurors discussing how complicated the scientific evidence seemed, and her stomach knotted with anxiety. The truth about Evelyn's murder, so clear in the evidence, was being deliberately obscured behind a veil of manufactured uncertainty. Sarah's own testimony became the most grueling experience of her professional life. For 3 days, she endured Whitman's relentless questioning, his strategy clearly aimed at portraying her as emotionally compromised and obsessive. "Detective Miller, how many hours would you estimate you spent on this case?" Whitman asked on the second day. "I didn't keep track," Sarah replied honestly. "Would you say you became obsessed with proving Dr. Hale's guilt?" "I followed the evidence," she countered. "My job was to be thorough." Whitman smiled slightly. "And your sister's disappearance, that had no bearing on your determination to find someone responsible for Mrs. Hale's disappearance?" Sarah gripped the witness stand, fighting for composure as her personal pain was weaponized against her credibility. Though she maintained professional responses, the emotional cost was devastating. Each night after testimony, she returned to her apartment physically ill, vomiting from stress and barely sleeping before returning to face another day of character assassination disguised as cross-examination. The defense's case brought forward a parade of character witnesses, former patients who spoke glowingly of Dr. Hale's compassion, colleagues who testified to his professional ethics, and current neighbors who described his generosity and community involvement. Their testimony created a stark contrast between the monster described by the prosecution and the beloved doctor presented to the jury. Most disturbing to Sarah was the testimony of Richard's nephew, who described childhood memories of a loving uncle who never got over losing Evelyn and kept her photograph beside his bed for decades. "He would talk to her picture sometimes," the nephew testified, his voice breaking with emotion, asking why she left him, saying he would have done anything to make her happy. The performance was masterful, creating reasonable doubt by separating the present-day defendant from the man who committed murder 50 years earlier. During this testimony, Sarah watched the jury's expressions shifting from suspicion to sympathy, and she experienced a moment of profound despair, the possibility that despite all the evidence, despite the truth they'd uncovered, justice might still be denied. The closing arguments crystallized the fundamental conflict at the heart of the trial. Rosen emphasized the totality of evidence, physical, circumstantial, and testimonial, that pointed to Dr. Hale's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. "Don't let the fog of time obscure what is clear," he urged the jury. Evelyn Hale tried to leave an abusive marriage. She filed for divorce. The next day, she disappeared. Her blood was on that scarf. Her remains were found buried where soil matching stains on a blanket her husband had cleaned. These aren't coincidences. They're evidence of guilt. Whitman focused on the passage of time, suggesting that memories fade, evidence degrades, and certainty becomes impossible across decades. The prosecution asks you to send an elderly man to die in prison, based on a patchwork of old materials and modern interpretations, he told the jury. The reasonable doubt here is as clear as the half-century that stands between us and the events in question. As the jury filed out for deliberation, Sarah felt hollow, drained by weeks of emotional battering and uncertainty. Whatever the outcome, she had paid an enormous price for pursuing this case. Her relationship, her professional reputation, her emotional stability, and most painfully, the protective barrier she had built between her work and her sister's unsolved disappearance. The jury remained out for 4 days. Each morning, Sarah and Lisa arrived at the courthouse, sitting silently side by side, waiting for news. Each evening, they left without resolution, the strain of anticipation leaving them both exhausted. Sarah barely ate or slept, running through evidence in her mind, questioning whether she could have done more, presented the case more clearly. On the 4th day, the call finally came. The jury had reached a verdict. As Sarah sat in the courtroom, watching the jurors file in, their faces gave nothing away. The foreman handed the verdict form to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Sarah held her breath, feeling Lisa's hand gripping hers with painful intensity. "On the charge of murder in the 2nd degree, how do you find?" the judge asked. The foreman stood. "We find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted in conflicting reactions. Gasps from Dr. Hale's supporters, quiet tears from Lisa, murmurs from the press section. Sarah sat perfectly still. the verdict washing over her without immediately penetrating the armor of tension she'd built up over the past months. "Doctor?" Hale showed little reaction beyond a slight stiffening of his shoulders as the verdict was read, his expression remaining inscrutably calm. The judge thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for the following month. As court officers led Dr. Hale away, he turned slightly, his eyes meeting Sarah's across the room. There was no remorse there, no acknowledgement, only the same cold assessment she'd seen during their jail interview. The gaze of a man who still, after all this time, believed he'd had the right to end his wife's life. Outside the courthouse, Rosen handled the press, while Sarah slipped away through a side entrance. She didn't want to make statements or answer questions. The victory felt too complex, too painfully won for sound bites and headlines. That evening, alone in her apartment, Sarah sat with the reality of what had been accomplished. Justice had finally been served for Evelyn, but the cost had been higher than she could have imagined when she first opened that dusty file. The truth had been exposed, but it couldn't undo 5 decades of silence and neglect. Nothing could give Evelyn back the life that had been taken from her. Nothing could erase the years her murder had gone unacknowledged and unpunished. Sarah opened her laptop and began typing her final report on the Hale case, finding a strange solace in the bureaucratic formality of procedure. The paperwork, at least, was straightforward. The emotions were anything but. After 4 days of jury deliberation, the verdict arrived. Sarah sat ramrod straight beside Lisa, both women clinging to composure as the courtroom settled into tense silence. When the jury foreperson rose and pronounced guilty on the charge of second-degree murder, the room erupted in conflicting reactions. Gasps from Dr. Hale's supporters, quiet tears from Lisa, and a dizzying wave of relief that nearly overwhelmed Sarah. Dr. Hale showed little reaction beyond a slight stiffening of his shoulders as the verdict was read, his expression remaining inscrutably calm. The judge thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for the following month. Then court officers led Dr. Hale away. In this moment of culmination, Sarah experienced not triumph, but a profound exhaustion. The case that had consumed her life for nearly a year had reached its resolution, leaving her with a success that felt strangely empty. As reporters clamored outside the courtroom and ADA Rosen delivered confident statements to the press, Sarah slipped away through a side entrance, returning alone to the familiar confines of her apartment. The days following the verdict brought Sarah back to familiar routines with unfamiliar perspective. She returned to the cold case division, greeted with congratulations and admiration from colleagues who had once doubted her pursuit. Detective Jenkins, who had initially dismissed the case as a wild goose chase, presented her with coffee and a sheepish smile. "That was some work, Miller," he admitted. "Never thought you'd actually pull it off." Captain Rodriguez called her into his office, where he presented her with a formal commendation and offered a promotion to senior detective, with supervisory responsibilities over junior investigators. "You've earned this," he told her, "not just for closing the Hale case, but for showing everyone the value of persistence in cold cases. We need your approach institutionalized, not just admired." The case files that had cluttered her living space for months were now boxed and archived, physical evidence returned to storage. Evelyn's scarf, preserved in a special display case, would hang in the department's memorial wall for resolved cold cases. Sarah moved through these professional acknowledgments with detached politeness, finding herself unable to fully embrace the recognition she once craved. The familiar rhythms of her work, morning coffee, case reviews, evidence analysis, resumed, but she approached them differently now, with a heightened awareness of both the possibilities and limitations of delayed justice. When a new detective asked for advice on approaching a 15-year-old missing persons case, Sarah found herself emphasizing the human element rather than just forensic techniques. "Remember, you're not just investigating a disappearance," she told him. "You're carrying someone's life in your hands. Their story deserves the same care you'd give a case that happened yesterday." Media interest in Sarah intensified despite her attempts to avoid the spotlight. A prominent true crime podcast featured her investigation methods, magazine profiles hailed her as a champion for forgotten victims, and a cable network proposed a documentary about the case. She declined most interviews but agreed to participate in educational presentations for law enforcement training, sharing the investigative techniques that successfully bridged the 50-year gap. During one such presentation at a police academy, a young cadet asked what motivated her relentless pursuit of such an old case. The question caught Sarah off guard with its simplicity, forcing her to articulate something she'd only recently come to understand herself. "Justice doesn't have an expiration date," she told the attentive audience. "We owe the same dedication to victims whether they disappeared yesterday or 50 years ago. Their lives mattered. Their truth matters." The words felt genuine yet incomplete, acknowledging her professional commitment while omitting the personal wounds that had driven her pursuit. Sarah was still learning to integrate these aspects of herself, to acknowledge that her effectiveness came partly from her personal connection to loss without letting that connection compromise her objectivity. Sarah's return to familiar surroundings was punctuated by moments of unexpected connection. Lisa McAdams invited her to dinner, a quiet evening where they shared memories and reflections rather than evidence and court strategies. Their relationship had evolved beyond the boundaries of the case, founded on mutual understanding of loss and persistence. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked as they lingered over coffee. Lisa looked thoughtful. "I'm thinking of starting a support group for families of cold case victims. There's so little out there for people waiting decades for answers." "That sounds perfect," Sarah said, realizing how much she'd come to value Lisa's steady presence during the trial. "You'd be good at that." More surprisingly, Marcus reached out with a tentative invitation for coffee. Their meeting was awkward at first, months of distance creating an unfamiliar formality between them. "I saw you on the news," he said, stirring his coffee unnecessarily. "You look different somehow." Sarah nodded, not sure how to explain the transformation she'd undergone. "The case changed me," she said simply. "Made me look at some things I'd been avoiding." "I'm glad," Marcus said, and seemed to mean it. "For what it's worth, I'm proud of what you accomplished. I just wish—" "I know," Sarah cut in gently. "Me too." They parted with no promises but a gentler understanding of why their relationship had ended. These connections, though familiar in form, felt different in substance. Sarah was returning to known territories as someone changed by her journey. On the day of Dr. Hale's sentencing, Sarah attended not as the lead detective, but as a silent observer seated in the back of the courtroom. She watched as the judge delivered a sentence that ensured the elderly doctor would spend his remaining years in prison, listened as Lisa delivered a powerful victim impact statement on behalf of her aunt, and observed Dr. Hale's continued stoic demeanor. When given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, he offered no apology, no explanation beyond a terse statement. "I've lived a good life of service. One mistake shouldn't erase that." His words crystallized for Sarah the fundamental disconnect that had allowed him to murder his wife and live 5 decades without apparent remorse. The belief that Evelyn's life was somehow less valuable than his own accomplishments. As the proceedings concluded, Sarah quietly exited, returning to her desk at the precinct, where a stack of cold case files awaited her attention. She opened the top folder, a missing person case from 1972, and began reading with familiar methodical focus, but a profoundly altered perspective on what justice means and what it costs those who pursue it. The case concerned a young woman who had vanished from a factory where she worked, leaving behind a young child and confused coworkers. The original investigation had quickly stalled, with notes suggesting she had likely run off with a boyfriend. Sarah recognized the dismissive language from Evelyn's file, the same assumptions about women's lives and choices. But where once she might have approached such a case with righteous anger, she now felt a more tempered determination, a commitment to truth that acknowledged both the importance and the limitations of delayed justice. "Let's see what really happened to you," she murmured to the photograph, beginning a new timeline with the same care she'd given Evelyn's case, but with a heart more aware of its own wounds and a mind more conscious of its own motivations. Sarah sat in Dr. Kaminsky's office, a space she would have avoided just months earlier. The room was deliberately calm, soft lighting, neutral colors, comfortable seating, arranged to suggest conversation rather than confrontation. Sarah still felt out of place here, but less so than during her first reluctant visit. "I keep dreaming about Evelyn," she admitted, fingers tracing the edge of her chair. "Not nightmares exactly, but she's always trying to tell me something I can't quite hear." Dr. Kaminsky nodded, allowing Sarah the space to continue. Her approach over their 6 sessions had been gentle but persistent, never pushing too hard, but never letting Sarah retreat entirely behind her professional facade. "I thought solving her case would bring closure, for her family, for me, but it's opened something instead. Grief doesn't follow a linear path," Dr. Kaminsky observed. "Neither does healing. You're learning to carry both your successes and your losses differently now." Over the past 6 weeks since the trial's conclusion, Sarah had committed to weekly therapy sessions, a significant departure from her previous reluctance to examine her own motivations and emotional responses. This willingness to acknowledge vulnerability represented perhaps the most profound change in Sarah, the recognition that strength lay not in compartmentalization, but in integration, that her effectiveness as a detective need not come at the expense of her humanity. The cold case division felt simultaneously familiar and strange to Sarah as she navigated her new role supervising junior detectives. The promotion had come with increased administrative responsibilities, but Captain Rodriguez had made it clear that her primary value was in mentoring others in her methodical, victim-centered approach. When a young investigator named Torres became frustrated with a seemingly unsolvable case, Sarah found herself sharing insights from Evelyn's investigation, not just the technical approaches, but the philosophical underpinnings of cold casework. "We're not just solving crimes," she told him during a late-night review session. "We're honoring interrupted lives." Torres looked up from the disorganized file he'd been sorting through. "Sometimes it feels impossible, though, like this one. 20 years cold, no physical evidence preserved. All the witnesses either dead or with memories too faded to be reliable. What's the point?" Sarah considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, she might have responded with platitudes about justice or determination. Now she had a different answer. "The point isn't always a conviction," she said. "Sometimes it's just making sure someone's looking, really looking, at what happened. Sometimes it's giving a name back to someone who became just a case number." This perspective represented a significant evolution from her earlier, more clinical approach. While still meticulous and evidence-driven, Sarah now emphasized the human elements behind the files, encouraging her team to connect with victims' families and understand the cultural and social contexts surrounding historical cases. Captain Rodriguez noted the change with approval during her performance review. "You've always been our best investigator, Miller. Now you might become our best teacher, too." Sarah's relationship with her own family underwent subtle but significant transformation. For the first time in decades, she visited her parents' home for an extended weekend, bringing with her a box of Rachel's belongings that she'd kept since her sister's disappearance. The box had followed Sarah through 3 apartments, always stored carefully but rarely opened. It contained the items police had recovered from Rachel's car, found abandoned at the trailhead. A sweater, a dog-eared paperback, sunglasses, and a mixtape labeled Road Trip Tunes in Rachel's looping handwriting. Together, Sarah and her parents sorted through these preserved memories, not as evidence, but as treasures, touchstones to the person Rachel had been, rather than just the mystery of her disappearance. "I think I've been trying to solve Rachel's case through every other investigation," Sarah confessed, as they sat surrounded by these fragments of her sister's life. Her mother took her hand, eyes filled with tears and understanding. We've all found different ways to keep her with us. Her father, who had rarely spoken about Rachel in the years following her disappearance, picked up the mixtape. Remember how she used to blast music in her room? Drive us crazy with those rock bands. They laughed softly, sharing memories that had been too painful to touch for years. This shared acknowledgement didn't diminish Sarah's desire to eventually learn the truth about Rachel, but it reframed her professional mission. No longer a desperate attempt to fill an unfillable void, but a commitment born of genuine empathy for other families living with unresolved loss. On the anniversary of Evelyn's disappearance, Sarah visited the memorial garden where Lisa had placed a small plaque honoring her aunt. The autumn afternoon was quietly beautiful, golden light filtering through trees beginning to shed their leaves. Sarah placed a single white rose beside the plaque, then sat on a nearby bench, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. Her phone buzzed with a message from Captain Rodriguez about a new cold case assignment, the 1963 disappearance of a civil rights worker whose family still sought answers. The familiar surge of determination rose within her, but it was tempered now with a wiser understanding of both the possibilities and limitations of delayed justice. She allowed herself a moment to honor Evelyn and acknowledge what this case had taught her before texting back her acceptance of the new assignment. The path forward was clear, not despite the changes she'd undergone, but because of them. Her commitment to forgotten victims remained unwavering, but she now carried it with greater wisdom about the personal costs and the importance of balance. The physical evidence of Sarah's transformation manifested in subtle ways throughout her life. Her apartment, once dominated by case files and evidence boards, now contains space for living. Books unrelated to criminology, a small collection of plants, art on walls previously reserved for timeline charts. She kept a journal, a practice recommended by Dr. Kaminsky, where she recorded not just case notes, but personal reflections, acknowledging the emotional impact of her work rather than suppressing it. Most significantly, she established boundaries between her professional and personal life, leaving the office at reasonable hours and participating in a weekly hiking group that took her to mountains similar to those where Rachel disappeared. Not as a form of torture, but as reclamation, a way of honoring her sister's love for wild places. These changes didn't represent an abandonment of her dedication, but a more sustainable expression of it, an integration of her professional mission with her personal well-being that allowed her to continue her work without being consumed by it. "You know what I realized?" she told Dr. Kaminsky during their most recent session. "Justice matters enormously, but it can't heal everything, and pursuing it shouldn't require sacrificing your own humanity." Dr. Kaminsky smiled. "That sounds like progress to me." Sarah nodded, feeling the truth of it settle within her. Evelyn deserved justice, but I think she would have wanted me to live too. 1 year after Dr. Hale's conviction, Sarah received an unexpected invitation in her email, a small ceremony at the Los Angeles Women's History Museum honoring Evelyn Hale and other women whose stories were obscured or forgotten by history. The event, organized by Lisa McAdams in collaboration with a feminist historian, aimed to reclaim narratives of women who were silenced by circumstance or violence. Sarah hesitated before accepting. Public recognition still made her uncomfortable, and she worried the event might sensationalize Evelyn's story rather than honor it. After a brief call with Lisa to discuss the approach, she finally agreed to attend. The museum was housed in a renovated historic building downtown. Sarah arrived early, moving quietly through exhibits documenting women's experiences across different eras of Los Angeles history. The Evelyn Hale display was tasteful and thoughtful. Photographs, diary excerpts, and contextual information about women's legal and social status in 1950s America. "We wanted to focus on her life, not just her death," Lisa explained, joining Sarah before the small crowd arrived. "Who she was, not just what happened to her." The exhibit emphasized Evelyn's intelligence, her work as a nurse before marriage, her love of art and literature. It presented her attempted divorce not as scandal, but as an act of courage in an era when women had few legal rights and little social support for leaving marriages, no matter how abusive. Observing visitors engaging with this material, Sarah realized that justice extended beyond legal verdicts. It included restoring dignity and context to lives prematurely ended, ensuring they were remembered for more than their tragic endings. Sarah's professional approach continued evolving as she established new protocols for the cold case division. Drawing from her experience with Evelyn's case, she implemented a comprehensive review system that incorporated historical and cultural context analysis alongside traditional forensic examination. When we look at cases from the 50s, 60s, even the 80s, we need to understand the cultural assumptions that might have limited the original investigation. She explained during a department training session, certain victims weren't given the same attention. Certain suspects weren't scrutinized as carefully. Cases involving women and marginalized communities received particular scrutiny, acknowledging the historical biases that often led to inadequate initial investigations. When budget constraints threatened these initiatives, Sarah successfully advocated for their continuation by demonstrating improved case resolution rates and positive community impact. Her presentation to department leadership revealed a newfound political savvy. She was no longer just a detective focused on individual cases, but an advocate for systemic improvement, comfortable leveraging her reputation and expertise to create institutional change. This expanded perspective represented a significant evolution from her earlier, more isolated approach to her work. Personal growth manifested in Sarah's cautious re-entry into social connections. She joined a support group for families of missing persons, not just seeking comfort for her own loss, but offering wisdom and understanding to others navigating similar terrain. "I spent 20 years thinking I had to solve my sister's case to move forward," she shared during one meeting. "Now I understand that healing and searching can happen at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive." Through this community, she met Michael, a journalist whose brother had disappeared during a hiking trip 15 years earlier. Their shared experience created an immediate understanding that gradually blossomed into friendship and eventually a tentative romantic connection. Unlike her relationship with Marcus, this connection didn't require Sarah to compartmentalize her work or her grief. Michael understood both as integral aspects of her identity. When she shared details about difficult cases or her continuing hope for answers about Rachel, she didn't encounter well-intentioned but distancing sympathy, but genuine comprehension. "You don't have to be careful around me," Michael told her during an early dinner date. "I get it. The not knowing changes you. You don't have to pretend it doesn't." This relationship, built on mutual understanding of loss and resilience, represented Sarah's willingness to risk vulnerability again, to believe that her dedication to justice and her capacity for personal connection could coexist. Sarah's transformation became evident during a high-profile conference on cold case investigation techniques, where she was invited as a keynote speaker. Standing before an audience of law enforcement professionals, she presented not just the forensic and procedural innovations from Evelyn's case, but also addressed the emotional and psychological dimensions of long-term investigations. "We're trained to maintain distance," she told the attentive crowd. "But true investigative insight often requires empathy, the ability to see the humanity in both victims and perpetrators." Emotional intelligence isn't a liability in this work, it's an asset. This balanced perspective, technical expertise informed by emotional intelligence, earned her respect from colleagues and established her as a thought leader in her field. During the conference, she was approached by representatives from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, who proposed a collaborative project examining cold cases with potential links to unidentified serial offenders. This opportunity, which would have once seemed a distraction from her focused pursuit of individual justice, now appealed to Sarah as a way to expand her impact while continuing to honor forgotten victims. She agreed to consult on the project 1 week per month while maintaining her position with LAPD. "You're building quite a reputation," Captain Rodriguez remarked when she told him about the FBI project. "Never thought I'd see you willingly splitting your attention between cases." Sarah smiled. "I'm learning that sometimes a broader view helps everyone, including me." The most profound evidence of Sarah's transformation emerged when she received unexpected news about Rachel's case. A hiker discovered human remains in an area previously searched, along with identification belonging to Sarah's sister. The development brought painful certainty after decades of ambiguity. Rachel likely died from exposure after becoming disoriented on the trail, a tragic accident rather than a crime. Sarah processed this revelation with a grief that felt simultaneously fresh and ancient, but she found herself equipped with resources she lacked before: a support system, healthy coping mechanisms, and the hard-won wisdom that closure isn't a destination, but a process. During Rachel's memorial service, held 26 years after her disappearance, Sarah delivered a eulogy that honored her sister's vibrant life rather than focusing solely on her disappearance. "Rachel taught me to look for beauty in unexpected places," she told the gathered mourners. "That lesson guided me through darkness I couldn't have navigated otherwise." Michael stood beside her at the small cemetery, his steady presence a comfort rather than an intrusion on this most private grief. Later, as they walked together beneath trees beginning to show autumn colors, Sarah realized she was experiencing something she hadn't felt in years: a sense of possibility, of life continuing to unfold rather than being frozen in the moment of loss. "I think Rachel would have liked you," she told Michael, linking her arm through his. "I wish I could have met her," he replied simply. This ability to find meaning without diminishing loss represented the integration of Sarah's personal and professional identities. She remained dedicated to seeking justice for others, but now carried this mission with a more complete understanding of its purpose and limitations, forever changed by her journey through Evelyn's case and her own grief. 5 years after Evelyn Hale's case, Sarah stood in the Cold Case Division's newly renovated office space, surveying the expanded team and resources that represented her most tangible professional legacy. What began as her solitary pursuit had evolved into a specialized unit with dedicated forensic support, historical research capabilities, and trauma-informed family liaison protocols. A glass display case near the entrance held meaningful artifacts from successfully resolved cases, including Evelyn's silk scarf, preserved as a reminder of how seemingly small details can bridge decades. Sarah's promotion to unit commander came with the understanding that she would divide her time between active investigations and developing training programs for other departments establishing similar divisions. As she watched her team, a diverse group of detectives she had personally selected and mentored, discussing strategy for a 1970s case involving indigenous women, she felt a quiet pride. Detective Torres, once uncertain about the value of pursuing justice across decades, was now passionately arguing for expanding their investigation to include similar disappearances that might reveal a pattern. "The connections between these cases weren't obvious in the original files," he explained to the group, pointing to his meticulous timeline. "But when we incorporate the historical context of how Indigenous women's disappearances were handled, or rather, not handled, a pattern emerges." Sarah nodded approvingly. The seeds planted during Evelyn's investigation had grown into systematic improvements, ensuring that forgotten victims received the thoroughness and dignity they deserved. Sarah's personal life had found a balance that once seemed impossible. Her relationship with Michael had deepened into a marriage characterized by mutual support and understanding. They shared a modest home in a quiet neighborhood, where Sarah had established clear boundaries between work and personal space. Case files rarely crossed the threshold, and she maintained regular hours that allowed for shared meals and weekend hikes. Rachel's memory occupied a healthy place in their household, honored through photographs and occasional stories, rather than haunting absence. When Sarah experienced difficult days triggered by particularly challenging cases, she no longer isolated herself, but practiced the communication and self-care strategies developed through continued therapy. That day, Michael asked one evening, finding Sarah unusually quiet after returning from work. "Tough one," she admitted. "We identified remains from a 1968 case. Had to notify the sister, she's in her 80s now. Been waiting for answers most of her life." Instead of retreating into silence or deflecting with assurances that she was fine, Sarah shared the weight of the day. "It was hard, but important. She thanked me for not forgetting her brother." This integration, professional dedication complemented by personal fulfillment, represented the resolution of the internal conflict that had once driven her to seek redemption through work alone. The anniversary of Evelyn's case brought an unexpected invitation, a documentary premiere at a small film festival focused on how cold case resolutions impact communities and families. The filmmaker had interviewed Lisa McAdams, Ada Rosen, now a Superior Court judge, forensic specialists who worked on the case, and even Dr. Hale himself, who had agreed to speak from prison shortly before his death, 3 years after conviction. Sarah attended with initial reluctance, but found herself moved by the thoughtful treatment that avoided sensationalism in favor of examining cultural attitudes toward domestic violence across generations. The documentary included historical context about women's legal status in the 1950s, the social stigma attached to divorce, and the evolution of forensic techniques that eventually made justice possible. During the post-screening discussion, a young woman approached Sarah, revealing herself as a forensic anthropology student, inspired to enter the field after learning about Evelyn's case. "You showed me that science can serve justice even when it seems too late," she explained with earnest enthusiasm. "I'm specializing in cold case forensics because of the work you did." This encounter crystallized for Sarah how individual actions create ripples extending far beyond immediate outcomes. Her determination had inspired others to continue similar work, ensuring that her impact would outlast her own career. Sarah's evolution became most evident during her annual lecture at the Police Academy, where she shared insights from her most challenging cases with new recruits. Once technical and procedural in focus, her presentations now incorporated psychological and ethical dimensions of cold case work. "The measure of justice isn't always a conviction," she told them, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "Sometimes it's returning a name to the nameless, acknowledging a life that mattered, or simply refusing to abandon those society has forgotten." This nuanced perspective, justice as restoration rather than merely punishment, reflected Sarah's deepened understanding of her work's purpose. She encouraged these future officers to consider the historical and social contexts of crimes, to recognize the biases that often determine which cases receive resources, and to approach victims and families with genuine empathy. When a cadet asked about the personal toll of such emotionally demanding work, Sarah didn't offer platitudes about professional distance, but instead spoke honestly about the importance of balance, community, and self-awareness. "The system will push you toward compartmentalization," she cautioned. Hale's grave the previous week, a simple marker in a county cemetery, largely forgotten since his death in prison. The visit wasn't motivated by lingering anger or a desire for vindication, but by a complex acknowledgement of how their lives became intertwined across time. She wrote about her conversation with Lisa, now in her 70s, but still actively involved in advocacy for cold case resources and domestic violence awareness. Most importantly, she reflected on her own journey, from a detective driven by unresolved personal loss to a leader who had found purpose in transforming systemic approaches to forgotten victims. As she closed the journal, Sarah's gaze fell on a small framed photograph on her desk. Rachel and Sarah as teenagers, laughing in mountain sunshine. Beside it stood a newer addition, Sarah and Michael at their wedding, surrounded by friends and colleagues who had become family. These images represented not separate worlds, but integrated aspects of a life fully lived, marked by loss but not defined by it. Sarah turned off her office light and headed home, carrying with her the wisdom that justice, like healing, is not a destination, but a continuous journey, one she now navigated with hard-won balance and peace. Outside, the evening air carried the promise of autumn, and Sarah took a moment to breathe it in before getting into her car. Once, she might have stayed late, losing herself in case files until exhaustion forced her home. Now she moved with purpose toward the life she had created beyond her work. Dinner with Michael, plans for the weekend, the steady rhythm of days that honored both her commitment to justice and her right to happiness. As she drove away from the precinct, Sarah thought briefly of Evelyn, not as a victim or a case file, but as a woman whose interrupted life had, in some strange way, helped Sarah find her own path to wholeness. The connection between them, forged across 5 decades, had transformed them both, bringing Evelyn back into memory and history, and guiding Sarah toward a fuller understanding of what justice truly means. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty car. The words meant not just for Evelyn, but for Rachel, for all the lost ones whose stories had shaped her journey. Then she turned up the radio, letting music fill the space as she headed home, the balance of remembrance and forward motion finally feeling right.